All right, hello class. This is going to be the first lecture on chapter 14, which is on the brain and the cranial nerves. I'm slowly recovering from my first case of COVID here in December of 22. So slowly but surely coming back. Let me share my screen here. Share. Okay. Now, full screen. There we go. All right, so previously we covered the spinal cord and spinal nerves, and now we're going to go up to the cranium and cover the brain. Okay, really, really big topic, lots to cover, and we only have really 3 days of to cover for the last week of the semester. So there's more material in this chapter than I obviously can cover in 3 lectures. And so I'm going to focus heavily on the anatomy of the brain, the cerebrum, the lobes, the brainstem, and then I will, along the way, be connecting structure with function. So let's get started here. Okay, so this is a picture of a human brain. It's a cadaver. And you can see it's a highly folded chunk of neural tissue. Now, everything here that you see here is nervous tissue, okay? Everything we've been talking about, neurons and glial cells, okay? And the folded nature of the brain is unique among higher vertebrates. So the more advanced or higher cognitive ability an animal has, the more folds it will contain, the animal's brain will contain. And pictured below is also a picture of a mushroom. What I like to describe the brain as like a mushroom has a stalk, and then there's a cap on the mushroom, right? So that's a very simplistic idea of what a mushroom is and comparing it to what a brain is. But this stalk-like structure that you can see descending down the bottom of the brain, that's the brainstem. And then attached posteriorly is this big bump. That's the cerebellum. We'll talk about that. And then this big cap-like structure that we think of when we think of the brain is what we call the cerebrum. Okay, the cerebrum, or the cerebral cortex, is the very, very outermost layer of that mushroom cap. There are some other structures that are buried here that we won't be able to see until we take a section through the brain. But if you hear me refer to the stalk and the cap, anatomically about kind of navigating around the brain, that's where I'm getting coming from. All right, here's some stats here on the brain, around 750 mils to 2100 mils. It contains most of our body's neural tissue. Of course, the spinal cord and the nerves have quite a bit, but there is a lot of neural tissue just compacted inside the brain. All the interconnectivity of mostly interneurons are collected in the brain. 97% of all neural tissue is in the brain. Okay, weighs about 3 pounds on average. And here's a picture that kind of puts both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system together. Now, it's not labeled well because at the top it says central nervous system, and at the bottom it says peripheral nervous system, to suggest that the spinal cord is not part of the central nervous system. So it's not entirely correct. So don't pay attention to that part of the diagram. But what I did like about it is that it was really putting the brain on top of the spinal cord and kind of maintaining it in connection, which you don't see very many figures do that. And so that's the reason why I liked this one, and I chose to include it in the notes here. On the bottom there, it's really showing a diagrammatic way of showing the autonomic nervous system, the somatic on the right and the autonomic on the left. And we have talk about the parasympathetic, sympathetic. We'll get into that a little bit later. But we will be covering the various lobes of the brain and the different parts. So just a note here as we go into the brain about kind of anatomic position and how we navigate through around the brain, because the axes change just slightly when we enter in the brain. Okay, now notice here as the neck region, we have what we've come to know as our typical anatomic position, meaning superior, inferior, right? And then as we get into the middle of the brain, it kind of goes to a T-stop, right? There's a change in the angle. And so rostral caudal is the terminology that you will hear in neuroscience. Rostral meaning towards the front or top, and caudal meaning tail, meaning towards the back. And dorsal ventral means back versus belly in the neck region. So when we're talking about the spinal, the brain stem and the spinal cord, dorsal ventral has a very specific orientation. But with respect to the brain itself, dorsal ventral has a slight tip to it. Okay, so dorsal means really the top of the brain, and ventral means the underbelly or the underside of the brain. So keep that in mind. It's not going to really come up a whole lot, but I thought I would show this figure because it is something to keep in mind. Also, the brain's structure is so complex, it is often difficult to appreciate all of its components with just a simple side view or top view or etc. And so there's various ways of displaying the brain. Okay, we take different sections through the brain, either a sagittal section, okay, a right or a left mid-sagittal section, or a coronal section is very common. The transverse section that here on the bottom is very rare, I'm going to say. It is more common to see the transverse section through the brain stem and the spinal cord, as we've seen in the previous chapter. But the most common you will see for the brain is a sagittal section or a coronal or frontal section, as you can see here on the top and the side. All right, so here is a nice go-to diagram. It's a sagittal section of the brain, and it's divided up into the four principal parts, okay? The cerebrum, shown in that light purple color, the cerebellum, shown in the blue, the diencephalon in the brown, and the brainstem, shown in the green, okay? So let me go through those a little bit more slowly. I want you to really know the locations and the terms and these different names, okay? So as I said, we're going to start at the top. Let's work our way down. The cerebrum, okay? Everybody say cerebrum, cerebrum. That is different than the cerebellum, okay? Cerebrum is the majority of the brain tissue is in the cerebrum, okay? It's when we refer to the cortex, we're referring to the cerebral cortex 9 times out of 10, okay? So the cerebrum has these 5 lobes, okay? The frontal lobe, parietal, occipital, temporal, and insula. Insula is the only one here that's new. All the rest of these will be familiar because we've learned our bones already, okay? So the frontal, of course, on the front, the parietal and the occipital are where you would imagine them. Temporal is along the outside. Again, you can't see the temporal lobe on this section because we are now viewing a sagittal section. So it has been removed. So you'd have to see an uncut section to see the temporal lobe. The insula is, again, kind of mysterious in how to find its location. I will be pointing that out in subsequent slides. It is kind of a hidden lobe, okay? It means you have to peel back the lobes between the temporal and the parietal and the frontal lobes to see the insula. It is, in fact, insulated. So I'll be pointing that out as well. But insula is like the hidden lobe. So that's the cerebrum, okay? Number 2 is the cerebellum, okay? Cerebellum, okay? That's shown in blue. That is really attached to the posterior of the brainstem, okay? It lies in the back of the brain, okay? So whenever you're trying to get your orientation for front or back of the brain, the cerebellum is always posterior, okay? Cerebellum. It has this small mini brain type of appearance, and that's exactly what cerebellum means. It means mini brain. And its attachment is at the level of the pons, which is the middle part here of the brainstem. It is not attached to the cerebrum. It is actually attached to the brainstem. Okay, so that's in blue. In brown is kind of this vague region. This is probably one of the hardest areas or structures to identify for A&P students is the diencephalon. So if I talk about the stalk and cap, right? So right where the stalk of the mushroom attaches to the cap, okay, think about the attachment point. If you were to twist off the cap of a mushroom off of the stalk, where it's ripping apart from the attachment would be the diencephalon, okay? So the diencephalon sits at the top of the brainstem, okay? And there's three parts there: the hypothalamus, the thalamus, and the epithalamus, okay? They all contain, as you can see, the word thalamus, okay? Epithalamus is the one that is more rare. You might not hear that term used a whole lot because typically all textbooks refer to is the pineal gland, okay? The pineal gland or the epithalamus are synonymous as far as we're concerned. So if all you see is the pineal gland or the pineal gland, that's the same as the epithalamus. Thalamus is big time. That's a really important structure. Hypothalamus also. We'll come back to those a little bit later, but those are shown here in brown. Here's the thalamus. And this little, I think it looks kind of like a bird's beak. Okay, if this is the eye and this is like a duck's head or something, like a wood duck, I don't know. Okay, I always describe this front part here is the hypothalamus. Hypo means under. Okay, so again, with that tipped perspective of the brain axis, ventral or under, it would be on this side or this surface of the brain. Diencephalon, three parts, 1, 2, 3. Okay, and the pineal gland, sorry, one more thing. Pineal gland is this structure right here in the back, okay? All right, lastly, the brainstem, okay? The brainstem is the stalk of the mushroom, okay? So at the very top in the lightest shade of green, we have the midbrain. Then we have the pons, which is this nice rounded, looks kind of like a rounded beer belly or so, like a pregnant lady's kind of rounded belly. Okay, that's the pons. So I always imagine this is like a big letter O. So when you're spelling the word pons, P-O, a big O, and then N-S, pons. Pons means bridge. And so it's really a bridging section between the cerebellum and the cerebrum. And not only the cerebellum and cerebrum, but also the cerebrum and the spinal cord. And then lastly, in the darkest shade of green is the medulla oblongata, okay? Medulla oblongata, okay? Or just the medulla is sometimes a shortened form. This is also acceptable. Okay, so with a name like midbrain, let's go back to this light shaded green here at the top. That's the part that attaches to the, it's the part that attaches to the diencephalon. So the midbrain is attached to the thalamus, okay? They're kind of attached, they're proximal to each other. And you would think with a name like midbrain, it would be like a bigger structure. It's actually really quite small. It's important because there's an important thoroughfare or a duct or passageway where neurons are kind of entering into the rest of the brain. But we'll come back to that as well. So know these locations, okay? Cerebrum, cerebellum, diencephalon in the brain stem. Here's again, a cadaver brain that has been kind of color-coded. In the brownish color is the cerebrum. This purple is the diencephalon. The rounded part here at the very top is the thalamus. This kind of pointed part at the front would be the hypothalamus. At the very back would be the epithalamus or the pineal gland. In yellow would be the midbrain. In the green, light green would be the pons. And in the, I guess that's orange, that'd be the medulla. And this kind of grayish blue would be the cerebellum, okay? Again, always get your orientation. Make sure that cerebellum is in the back, okay? Cerebellum is in the back. Now, another key thing, we're looking at this in the sagittal section, okay? So we have a nice slice through the brain. But I want you to notice something. One, the only thing that's really chopped here is the cerebellum, the brainstem, and diencephalon are all cut, okay? But most of the cerebrum is not cut, okay? What we're looking at here is the medial surface of the in this case, the right hemisphere, okay? We're gonna talk about the hemispheres in just a bit. You can see up in the upper left-hand corner, this is a picture of the brain, and this blue plate of glass, so to speak, is kind of slicing through there. But these infoldings here, these gyri and sulci, are not a cut surface. Okay, this right here, it looks kind of like somebody's ear. Okay, if you look at it from the side, kind of look, here's the earlobe and here's the ear, or maybe it's this way. Anyways, this kind of C-shaped rounded structure, that's a cut. Okay, that's really the only part here that is severed when you're making this transverse section through the cerebrum. This C-shaped structure is called, it's very important, it's called the corpus callosum, okay, the corpus callosum. And it is the connection point between the right and the left hemisphere in the cerebrum. Okay, so the corpus callosum. Okay, whenever you see this structure, you'll know that you're looking at it from a sagittal section. Okay. All right. So this and the top is not a sagittal section, but this would be a coronal or frontal section. Okay, we're separating front from back with this type of section, and so we're looking. Let's say you're looking head on at somebody's brain. You can see a nice look at the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, and the structure I was just talking about, the corpus callosum, is this chunk of white matter right here. Okay, it's reaching across from the right all the way over to the left. It really forms the attachment between the right and left hemispheres. Okay, just below that, this dark area, or the dark brown, that is the thalamus. Okay, thalamus. All the rest here, you can see, again, appreciate the white matter and the gray matter. Okay, the white matter is the lighter color and the gray matter is the darker. Notice that the gray matter is on the outside. This undulating or curving layer is called the cortex. Okay, this is called the cerebral cortex. Just that outer gray matter. Okay, all of this is the cerebrum. Just the outer gray matter is the cerebral cortex. Now, I put the slide up here to point out the difference between the orientation of white matter and gray matter in the brain versus the spinal cord. Drop down, remember in the spinal cord, the white matter is on the outside, on the exterior, and the gray matter is on the inside. Okay, that H or butterfly shaped tissue is the gray matter. Okay, that's internal, the white matter surrounds it. In the brain, it's reversed. Okay, the white matter is on the inside, and the gray matter is on the outside. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. All right, lots more to explore here, but we need to keep going. Eventually, we're going to get to a slide like this, where we're going to start to appreciate the various regions in the cerebrum, okay, and begin to specify regional areas of different function. Okay, well, this part's for speech, and this part is for hearing, and this part is for vision, and this part is for sensing. Okay, and we will get there eventually. The first thing I'll just mention right now is if you look right in the top, in the middle, you'll see a red section and a blue section. Okay, there's kind of this navy blue, almost looks purple. Okay, that navy blue ridge of cerebrum. Okay, and then there's a bright red right next to it. Okay, there's this bifurcating, it's called the central sulcus, excuse me. The central sulcus divides what we call the frontal lobe, which is on the left, and the parietal lobe, which is on the right. Okay, and that's actually a huge landmark, very, very important. Okay, if we go back one slide, okay, remember as we were talking about the way that information is connected to the spinal cord, right? We said that when information is approaching the spinal cord, it enters dorsally, right? Same Dave. Okay, so dorsal afferent, ventral efferent, right? So we enter through the back and then we exit through the front. Okay, that's important. So let's bring that to the brain. So all of our afferent or sensory information is entering into the back of the spinal cord. That's what we said, right? That's preserved here, okay? So all of the back of the brain is all sensory, okay? All of the back of the brain is sensory input, okay? We're receiving afferent data into the back of the brain, okay? Vision, hearing, touch, etc. Okay. The front of the brain is really motor control and higher executive function. Okay. There's two things I said there. Motor control. Okay. So motor control means the parts of our brain that are sending outgoing signals down to the body to command muscles and glands and stuff like that. Okay. As well as processing thoughts and memories and planning and problem solving. Okay. Higher executive function. So that's just one easy, not easy, but an important landmark to distinguish front of the brain, back of the brain. All of the back of the brain is sensory. All the front of the brain is motor and higher executive function. Okay. Think about thinking. Now, one last really key and foundational concept, and that's all of these are a little bit challenging to kind of adopt right away because they're big concepts, but the triune brain, okay? So another huge paradigm when we're thinking about the brain is not so much anatomically, because we're going to go in more detail on the anatomy, but before I dive into the anatomy in more detail, I wanted to introduce this concept of the triune brain, okay? It's really associating a little bit of function with the structure. And so you might have hear people refer to like the reptilian brain or the mammalian brain or the human brain. Hold on a second here. There we go. And so there's three general parts or regions in the brain that is referred to here, okay? And in the gray, in that diagram, is referred to as the reptilian brain, okay? And in the red is the limbic or the emotional brain. And in the blue, all the rest of it would be the neocortex or the human brain, okay? Or the mammalian brain, sometimes called, as different people call it different things, okay? There's one more here. Let me click here. There we go. The three-parted brain, same thing as the triune brain. Okay, if you hear triune or tripartite or three-parted brain or reptilian brain, those are all coming to the same concept. And that is the most fundamental core processing ability of the brain is located in the brain stem. Okay, the brain stem in this upper figure is indicated in gray, and then this kind of yellowish box here, it's indicated in red. It says lizard brain, okay, the brain stem and the cerebellum, okay. The most foundational wiring of our brain, okay, the processing power of our brain for our bodies, for breathing and beating, controlling heartbeat and controlling body temperature and controlling other homeostatic mechanisms is in the brainstem, okay? So you think about staying alive. Can I kind of quote the Bee Gees song, staying alive, oh, oh, oh. Okay, the brainstem is the structure that is necessary. It's vital for staying alive. If you break the brainstem, you die, okay? You can lose chunks of your cerebrum and you can live, okay? You might not think clearly or other parts of your personality might change or whatever, but you'll still live. If you lose parts of your brainstem, you will die because the centers there control breathing and heart rate and body temperature. All the like very fundamental homeostatic mechanisms are in the brainstem, okay? The next level up here would be the mammalian brain here in the yellow box shown in this purple, okay? Otherwise known as the limbic system, okay? It's shown in red in the top. This is really our social brain. How we think about our environment, how we perceive other people, other individuals in our species, in danger, how we perceive danger. How do we interpret our environment? How do we store memories, and emotional and social behaviors? Okay, that's our mammalian brain. Lastly would be the human brain. It's referred to as the neocortex. Okay, this is really the highest level of brain function. It's very abstract language formation. Okay, there are lots of animals live without language, okay? All the animals that we know about, besides maybe, I don't know, like dolphins and dogs, like do they bark at each other? Like there's no grammatical, right? Humans are the only animals, quote unquote, animals that have language, right? We encode meaning into letters and sentences, and we write them down and we share them and we send text messages and emojis to each other. Other animals do not do that. Okay, so the abstract capacity to communicate over long distances, okay, is something that requires this part of the brain. Okay, planning. Okay, so thinking about the future and being directed towards a goal, having memory, okay, complex storage of thoughts and memories, problem solving, okay, these are all higher order executive function that is what is referred to is connected to the human brain, or the neocortex, okay, the new cortex. Now, there's evolutionary reasons why they call this like the reptilian versus the mammalian versus the human, because they think developmentally over millions of years that first it was the lowest order, and then we evolved and evolved and evolved. Okay, so whatever your convictions about that, I don't think that you need to adopt that perspective to still maintain this view, this functional view of the brain, of the human brain. Okay, so I think there's important things to understand about this view that are helpful and right, that does not necessitate that you take on all the assumptions of macroevolution per se. But you will hear that terminology thrown around a lot, and people will just kind of assume that that's true. So again, here is those three divisions: the reptilian, instinct and survival. So like stay alive, homeostasis, eat, drink, sleep, have sex, find a sex partner, propagate the species in that regard. Okay, emotional limbic system, the neocortex is kind of abstract thought, language, and higher thinking skills. All right, so and there's a loose connection between the anatomy and the physiology there. That is, the reptilian brain is this core, okay, it's the deepest part, it's right in the brainstem, and we kind of layer on top of that the mammalian or limbic system, and then we layer on top of that the neocortex. So it's kind of like a kind of an inside out layering scheme there. And it's not perfect. I've shown you a couple different diagrams here to kind of suggest that. But just keep that in mind, and we'll come back to this a little bit later. Now we're going to transition away from this kind of heady stuff. We're going to go right back into like strict anatomy. Okay. All right. So now I said that there's these four principal parts of the brain. Okay. The cerebrum, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and the brainstem. Okay. We're going to briefly go through these four parts and describe a little bit about their function. Okay. So first, the cerebrum. Okay. This kind of light purplish color. It's the largest part of the brain, controls all those higher mental functions. It's divided into the right and the left hemispheres. You can see in the figure here to the upper right, you can see there's a large substantial cleft or fissure. Okay, it's called the longitudinal fissure that separates the right and the left hemispheres. Okay, this view here, we're looking kind of face to face with the human brain, and we're looking right at the front of the brain, the frontal lobe. Here's the two temporal lobes, and here's the pons and the medulla. The cerebrum is at the top. Okay. And the surface of the brain is all gray matter. Okay. The surface of the brain, the cortex, is all gray matter. Okay. The cerebrum. Okay. So here's a cut section. As I said before, the centimeter thick gray matter, that's called the cortex. Okay, and you can see that it kind of dips up and down, kind of like a roller coaster. And there's names here: the hills and valleys. Okay, the hill is called the gyrus, and the valley is called the sulcus. Okay, gyrus bumps up, and the sulcus dips down. Okay, so I always remember if I'm sulking, okay, I'm in a kind of a emotionally depressed and pouty mood, right? If I'm sulking, sulk means down, emotionally down. Okay, so sulcus means a valley. Okay, so gyrus is a hill. Okay, sulcus is a valley. If you have an especially deep sulcus, okay, we call it a fissure. Okay, a fissure is a deep sulcus. All right, so many gyri and sulci, and they have some uniformity from human to human. That is, they have the same wrinkling pattern, but not all brains are exactly the same. Okay, the wrinkling pattern is independent, and it can change a lot from between humans. But there are a couple important sulci that are conserved across humans. Now, again, I just mentioned sulcus or sulci, the plural, one sulcus, sulci, sulci. I've heard it pronounced both ways, sulcus or sulci and sulci. It's up to you what I think I'm leaning more towards sulci is the plural instead of sulci, but I'm unsure about that. All right, next big section here is the cerebellum, okay? Shown in blue, it's located on the back of the brain, takes up most of the back bottom of the brain case, okay? It would be resting more or less on the floor of the occipital bone. Remember, the occipital bone sits at the back. It's the second largest part of the brain, coordinates repetitive body movements. Okay, so cerebellum, I think about bellum balance. Okay, cerebellum balance. I think about riding a bicycle, balancing bicycle. I don't know. I love bicycles, so coordinated and fine tuning of motor movements. When you're riding a bicycle, you need to not fall over, right? So you are pedaling the bike and you are steering, right? And your hands, you're moving the handlebars so that the tire keeps you balanced so that as you move forward, you don't fall over. Okay. And even if you're like walking, like say you're a 2-year-old and you're just beginning to walk, okay, 1 to 2 years old, and you're kind of toddling around and your body is just learning to kind of put the feet down and kind of keep the balance and kind of hold your hands up to maintain that. Okay. So you're refining very gross, awkward motor movements. Okay. Or let's say you're learning to throw a ball. Okay. When you're a little kid, you're throwing the ball, and the first time you throw it, right, it kind of goes behind you, or you hold on too long and it hits the ground. Okay. You don't get that first ball, the ball doesn't go where it's supposed to the first time. And over time and practice and repetition, you begin to refine the coordination of the individual muscles, and the joints start to work together, and all of those things start to actually connect into one cohesive movement. That's what the cerebellum is about. It's really about refining and perfecting a motor movement. And so every day we're doing things that requires our brain is like initiating the movement. Like, I want to pick up that box. And so your hand reaches for it and you don't realize, oh, my hand was too low and I missed the handle. And then you just, without thinking, your cerebellum helps you adjust your hand position so that your fingers go into the little slot so you can pick up the box appropriately. Okay, that's kind of a difficult analogy, but think about fine tuning any motor movement, whether it's the positioning of a hand or the coordination of several muscle groups together for one activity, like throwing a ball. Okay, throwing a ball is a good example because you have the ball in your hand, you have the grasping part, you have the wrist is taut, and then you have the elbows flexed, and you have the shoulders back. Okay, so you have to bring it back, and then you start to initiate this coming forward. Okay, all of the flexion here, and then extension, and then release. Okay, there's lots of things going on in that one movement. Okay, the one action, I should say. Cerebellum. I'll talk too long about it. It has the very similar organization as the cerebrum. That is, it has white matter on the inside and it has gray matter on the outside. Okay. The white matter on the inside is called the arbor vitae, meaning the tree of life. So it looks like a little branched tree called the arbor vitae. Okay, it's part of the cerebellum. All right, so here is let's see, this is a left lateral view, not a sagittal, not a section, but just a left lateral view. In the peach tan color, you can see the cerebrum, and there's kind of a semi-transparent, you can see the thalamus is that round, that's the diencephalon, part of the diencephalon. In the green would be the midbrain, and the pons is here. Here's the medulla, and here's the cerebellum. It's kind of nestled in the back, okay? So there's the cerebellum. All right, next, okay? Talk about cerebrum, talk about the cerebellum. Now we're going to talk about the diencephalon, okay? Diencephalon, there's 3 parts, okay? They all include the word thalamus, right? The biggest part here is the thalamus. Okay, you have a right thalamus and a left thalamus, and they are sitting at the top of the brainstem. And they form the attachment between the brainstem and the cerebrum. Anterior and inferior to the thalamus is the hypothalamus. Okay, so this is where the thalamus would be right here. Okay, and the hypothalamus would be right here. The little, looks to me like a bird head. If this is the little eye of the bird, and this is the neck. Okay, this is the beak. The little dangly thing off the bottom of the beak is the pituitary. The beak here, just above the pituitary, is the hypothalamus. Okay, the hypothalamus is right here. Hypothalamus is a collection of nuclei. Okay, there's a collection of cell bodies, okay, that control and integrate brain function with endocrine function. That's what the hypothalamus does. The hypothalamus integrates brain function with endocrine function. Okay, the endocrine system is a system of glands, okay, how we control different glandular secretions and the metabolic control, etc. Okay, the hypothalamus is all about that, and it really communicates from the hypothalamus to the pituitary, and from the pituitary down into the adrenals and the thyroid and all kinds of other glands. Epithalamus is way at the back, this tiny little bump right there. There's a little bump, and it looks kind of like a pine cone. So pineal gland, I think about pine cone, because it's like a little pointy, not pointy so much, but a pine cone shaped gland. And its major thing is to secrete melatonin. Melatonin is our sleepy time hormone. Okay, it is released in the evening, and it helps our body. So when melatonin is released, it helps our body prepare for sleep. Okay, and if you have trouble sleeping, you might take melatonin pills. Okay, because it's a natural hormone that helps our body, our brain, kind of shut down and gets us ready. All right, so here's some of that information here. Thalamus. Okay, what do you need to know about the thalamus? You need to know, this is the thing you need to know, okay? The thalamus is super important as a sensory processing center, okay? It's the sensory processing center, okay? So all the ascending sensory data that's coming up into the neck and up into the brainstem, let's say your touch receptors, anything that's coming from your torso, all of that sensory information is coming up into the brain. It's going to hit the thalamus, okay, and it's going to synapse with some other neuron, and then it's going to project up into the cerebrum, okay? So all the sensory data comes up to the thalamus first, synapses, and then another neuron will go out into the rest of the brain, okay? Processing sensory data, that's the thalamus. Okay, there's lots of different nuclei in there. That is, there's different regions in the thalami for processing visual data and hearing data and touch data and etc. Okay, hypothalamus. Okay, what did I say? It integrates brain function and endocrine function. Okay, it's involved in hormone production because the hypothalamus makes its own hormones, and it communicates to the pituitary. That's one of the main things it does. Also, it's very important for mood and emotion. Okay, our sense of happiness or joy comes from our hypothalamus. Okay, it also controls a lot of autonomic function. Okay, so a lot of what the endocrine system does is to regulate homeostasis. Okay, staying alive. So the brainstem integrates with the hypothalamus and keeps things together. Okay, to keep us alive. Hypothalamus, I just said, produces melatonin. Melatonin is a hormone. Okay, the hormone gets released at nighttime. Okay, when the sun goes down, our eyes detect like, oh, lower light. Our pineal gland starts going secrete, 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 secrete. Let's pump out some melatonin. That floods into our brain, and our brain's like, oh, I'm getting a little bit tired. Time to go to bed. Okay, time to shut down for a little bit. Your brain never stops. Actually, it just shifts into a different mode, but it's resting. So it's important because there's a lot of oxidative stress and stuff that needs to be sorted out while we're resting, while we're sleeping. But our brain is not. Our brain activity is very high during sleep. And the melatonin prepares the brain for that transition. Okay, it's important. Now, just a note here about the pituitary. Okay, the pituitary is part of the endocrine system, not the brain. Okay, but it is attached to the hypothalamus. Okay, so this little bump here, remember sella turcica? What bone is that? You guys can remember, right? Somebody, you're shouting it right now, right? What's the little sella turcica is in the what bone? Sphenoid. Sphenoid bone. Okay, sphenoid bone is right here. Okay, it's the wings. Okay, from temple to temple. If I'm pressing here, it's the sphenoid bone in the middle. Okay, right in the, I can't point to it because it's right in the middle of your face. Okay, it's the pituitary. Okay, pituitary is one of the most important glands in your body. It's part of the endocrine system. Okay, it is physically attached through the infundibulum to the hypothalamus. Okay, so asterisk here, the little star, it's not part of the brain. It's not part of the diencephalon, but it is physically attached to it because developmentally, the anterior, let's see. There's the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary. And developmentally, it develops from brain tissue. Okay, but we no longer call it brain, we call it the endocrine system. All right, lastly, brainstem. Brainstem is shown in green. That's the stalk of the mushroom, as I like to say. Okay, 3 parts. Important thing here, the brainstem is important for processing information between the spinal cord and the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So all the information is going up into the brainstem and either back into the cerebellum or up into the brain. Okay, so there's all kinds of down and back and up and back and down and back and up. Okay, that's what the brainstem is. It's kind of coordinating all of the signals, zip, 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 down, up and down, up and down, up and down. Okay, and in the middle of the brainstem, there's a bunch of nuclei. Okay, there's a bunch of cell bodies where synapsing is occurring. Okay, and those are located inside of the brainstem. That's why it's so important, because there's little bundles of little nuclei, which are little collections of cell bodies where, in this case, it's where synapsing will occur. So midbrain is at the top, pons is in the middle, and medulla oblongata is at the bottom. Okay, let's go through. Okay, at the top, midbrain. Okay, it's also called the mesencephalon. I'm not going to ask you to know that, but developmentally, that is its origins. Midbrain is important for processing sight and sound data, also some association reflexes. There's some reflex processing that it does, and also our reticular formation runs through the midbrain. I'll show you a picture of that in just a bit. But on the back, okay, if you can see right here, if you see where my cursor is, there's 2 sets of bumps. Okay, so 2 bumps on the top and 2 bumps on the bottom. Okay, and so if you're just looking at my pointer fingers, just like that. Okay, there's a set of 4 bumps. It's called the corpora quadrigemina. The corpora quadrigemina is a set of 4 bumps, and the upper bumps are regulating vision, and the lower bumps are regulating hearing. Okay, that is, our sight data goes back in our brain to the thalamus and then projects to the midbrain. Okay, our hearing data back to the thalamus and then back to our midbrain and then to the different parts of our cerebrum. So processing, and both of those things, interestingly enough, are in stereo. We see in stereo and we hear in stereo, right? So we have binocular vision, and we're processing the one visual field two different ways. Same with our eyes, same with our ears. So the brainstem is processing both of those sets and seeing if they're off just a little bit, then it's interpreting that stereo vision or hearing. Okay, so it's kind of interesting. We don't smell in stereo, we don't taste in stereo, but we see and we hear in stereo. Okay, or binocular. So that's interesting. Pons. Okay, the pons literally means bridge. Okay, it connects the midbrain to the cerebellum and to the spinal cord. Okay, so it's just kind of a passageway for neurons to run through. There's very important nuclei there, okay, involved in somatic and visceral motor control. It's that round pot belly. Here's the PO. I think of that big O there for the rounded belly of a, I don't know, a pregnant lady or uncle, that your fat Uncle Phil from Thanksgiving. I don't know. All right, medulla oblongata at the bottom. Okay, medulla oblongata. Okay, if you guys watched, what's the Adam Sandler movie, Waterboy? Medulla oblongata. Very important, okay? Regulates autonomic functions like heart rate, blood pressure, and digestion, all that staying alive. Core body homeostasis is found in the medulla oblongata. She's like, well, that really important stuff is like way down at the bottom of the brainstem. Yep. Okay, it seems like kind of a funny place to put like the most basic things about keeping your body alive would be kind of nestled down in the very bottom there, but that's where it is, and that's why injury to the brainstem is almost certain negative prognosis. Okay, so you never want to have a brainstem injury because they're going to be a goner. All right, here's a picture in the, I don't even know what color that is, the light pinkish color. That's the diencephalon. Okay, it's just showing the thalamus is the round thing. The hypothalamus would be, it's honestly, this is not a very good picture. Here's the pituitary here. This is the midbrain, the round of the back. Those are your corpora quadrigemina. I'll show another picture of those. In the bluish color here, this is the pons, that little pot belly shape there. This is the connections to the cerebellum, which would be back here. And here's the medulla. You can talk about the pyramids and the olives a little bit later. These little yellow trunks that you see kind of sticking out that are cut, those are all cranial nerves, okay? And we're going to come to those in just a minute, okay? There's a bunch of little trunks sticking out, okay? Those are nerves that are emerging from the brainstem, okay? Most of the cranial nerves are coming out of the brainstem, not of the cerebrum. Okay, that's important, okay? Almost all of the cranial nerves come out of the brainstem, not out of the cerebrum. Just a few notes here on embryonic development. I am not going to ask you about these, so don't worry about memorizing them. But if you are going on in human anatomy and biology, they might expect you to know some of this terms. So it's maybe a good idea just to get familiar with some of these terms developmentally. So embryological development, there's kind of three big bumps, okay? The prosencephalon, the mesencephalon, and the rhombencephalon, okay? They all have the same ending, cephalon, which means the head, okay? So the pros is the tip of it, which looks kind of like the head. The mes, okay? Mes always means middle, and rhomboid, in this case, it's not like a shape, it means the tail, okay, or the end. So pros, mes, and rhomb, okay? That is the earliest developmental stage at 3 weeks of gestation, Okay, it's the earliest formation of neural tissue. Okay, 3 weeks of gestation, there have these 4 lumps, okay, that are differentiated, okay, microscopically. They form the neural tube. And then we go from those 3 kind of lumps to a slightly different arrangement, and we start to get more complexity here. Okay, the prosencephalon becomes the telencephalon and the diencephalon. The mesencephalon stays the mesencephalon. And then the rhombencephalon becomes the metencephalon and the myelencephalon. Okay, again, I'm not going to ask you to memorize those. That's confusing to me as it is to you. But the important thing is that there's a developmental timeline that through embryological development, there are different, that, you know, obviously all these structures take time to distinguish and to develop structural differences over weeks and days of gestation. And so that's mapped back here. This is a nice figure. You can see the brain regions in this column here, the midbrain, the diencephalon, cerebellum, the medulla, and then the ventricles here, the lateral ventricles, the third and the fourth ventricles, helps us to kind of organize the developmental timeline. All right, I'm gonna cover ventricles and then we'll be done, okay? So ventricles, okay? The ventricles are hollow chambers inside of the brain, okay, that are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Hey, buddy. Oh, thank you. He gave me a Pop-Tart. Ah, good. Ventricles. Sorry. You guys are probably hungry too. Ventricles are hollow chambers inside of the brain that are filled with cerebrospinal fluid, okay? Shown in green is a complex network of these hollow chambers, okay? You didn't know that your brain was full of hollow spaces, but it is. But it's not hollow. I mean, it's fluid filled, okay? And they have a very unique architecture. And that is because you think about them as, and they start off in those early phases of development. This is all a hollow space. So it's a hollow space with tissue surrounding it. It's a very supportive fluid, okay? So CSF is nurturing and providing nutrients to that surrounding tissue. So as the brain is growing, the ventricles with the CSF inside of it is allowing for the growth and proper development of the tissue that is kind of around, and using the ventricles as a food and nutrient source. Okay, so ventricles contain CSF. CSF is a nutrient-rich fluid that is distributing nutrients and gases and removing wastes, and doing that through our good friends, the glial cells, the ependymal cells, which have a special name called the choroid plexus. Okay, so each of the lobes in the hemispheres contains a portion of these ventricles. Okay, so let me let you look at this. This is another look at the kind of the complex shape. You can see the geometric shape of the ventricles is very hard to describe. I kind of call it like the ram's horn. They have a ram's horn shape to it on the upper part. Those kind of 2 ram's horn shapes are called the lateral ventricles. There's not 1 and 2. It's right or left or right, 1 or 2. It doesn't matter. We just call it the right lateral ventricle and the left lateral ventricle. Okay. The third ventricle, so that's 1 and 2. The third is in the middle, what looks like kind of like a little hole through it, looks like an eyeball. Okay, that's the third ventricle. Okay, that's shown right here with a little dotted red line in it. Okay, and then there's a little connection again to what's called the fourth ventricle. Okay, and the fourth ventricle is there sitting just in front of the cerebellum. Okay, so let's stop that spinning. So right and left lateral ventricle. Okay, then we have this little connection here that connects the lateral ventricles to the third ventricle. It's called the interventricular foramen. Okay, so the interventricle ventricular foramen. That's this little tunnel that's connecting the right and the left side, okay? This is called the third ventricle. That third ventricle actually is a very thin space between the thalami, okay? If you can think about your thalami are like this, they're sitting really close to each other. There's a little space between them that's fluid filled. That's your third ventricle. And then actually your thalami, if you think about like, they kind of touch at just one little spot, like right where my knuckles are touching. At that one spot, there's a solid mass. It's called the interthalamic mass, okay? And that's what this little structure is right there. That little peekaboo looks kind of like an eye hole. Okay, there's the interthalamic mass. It's where the two thalami are touching. So in between the thalami is the third ventricle. And then descending out of the third ventricle right here and dipping down right into this spot here is the fourth ventricle. Okay, now this is a rather flat view. Okay, it's actually a little bit broader if you go here. Okay, but that's the fourth right there. It's, again, weirdly shaped. It kind of looks like a kite to me. It has kind of a diamond shape to it. I'm not sure. Okay, here's from the front, lateral, lateral. Here's the third ventricle here. Okay, and here's the fourth ventricle here. Okay, connecting the third to the fourth is called the cerebral aqueduct. Okay, cerebral aqueduct connects the third to the fourth ventricle. And then the fourth ventricle descends and becomes the central canal. Remember the tiny little canal that runs all the way down the spinal cord? That's the central canal. Central canal comes up and becomes the fourth ventricle. So that fluid is circulating all the way through the spinal cord, from the brain all the way down into the spinal cord. All right. So we're going to come back and we're going to start talking about the the physical protection of the brain. I talk about the bones, the meninges. We talked about meninges already, so we'll be a little bit familiar with those. The cerebral spinal fluid. Talk about the blood-brain barrier and how that forms. Talk about how the meningeal layers help with managing the flow of fluid through the brain. Talk about blood flow through the brain, and we'll begin to specify the different regions of the brain. Okie dokie, that is it for today. Hope to see you guys soon.